Hello, children, and welcome again to Kids Story Time. Our story for today is about Ruth and Naomi. You'll actually find a book in the Bible called Ruth, and that book has a lot of what we're going to hear and probably discuss about. And what we're going to do today is have a condensed version of the entire story in the interest of time. But like I said, I would really encourage you, children, to go through the book of Ruth and read the story for yourselves. There's always a lot that you will understand when you go and read the scriptures and understand what the Lord has written in there for you. But yeah, in this story, we're going to try to summarize as much as we can from the entire story of Ruth. And it's a very interesting story, and we'll see a lot of God's faithfulness and his goodness towards Ruth and Naomi. All right, so let's go ahead and watch a short video, and once that is done, we will have a few questions.
In the days when God used judges to lead Israel, famine was widespread across the land. There was hardly any food to eat, nor water to drink. People were starving, and many families decided to move away in hope of a better life. One such family was that of a man named Elimelech, who took his wife Naomi and their 2 sons to the land of Moab. They were certain that they could make a better life there and were excited with the prospect of starting a new chapter. Once they got there, tragedy struck. The father of the family, Elimelech, died. His 2 sons took Moabite wives named Ruth and Orpah and lived there for 10 years. Then more disaster struck when they also died. This was devastating. Who was going to provide for them or protect them? Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah were left to fend for themselves. Naomi decided to go back to Israel, to the land she knew so well, to the people she understood, a language she knew, and a community who would accept her in her grief. She wanted her daughters, Ruth and Orpah, to stay in their land and start new families. But Ruth resisted. "No, I will go wherever you go. I want to be part of your people. I want to worship your God as well." So Ruth and Naomi began their journey to the land of Israel. After a long journey, they arrived in Bethlehem, Naomi's hometown. The entire town came out to welcome her back. They were so surprised to see Naomi after more than 10 years, but they were also struck by how old and sad she seemed. "Naomi, is that you?" they asked with excitement. But Naomi did not share their excitement. "Call me bitter, not Naomi. I have had a bitter experience," she said. Naomi and Ruth had arrived at harvest time, and the people were busy gathering grain. Naomi and Ruth had no sons or husbands or wealth. They desperately needed food. Naomi was too old to gather grain, so Ruth happily went out to see what she could find. She ended up gathering the leftover scraps in a field that belonged to a man named Boaz. This man was very rich and famous, and everyone knew of his noble character. He was kind to everyone, and he loved God. As Ruth gathered grain, everyone seemed to notice her. After all, she was from a different culture. She had different clothes and a different language. Boaz saw how hard she worked. He asked one of his managers, "Who is this girl who has been reaping in my field?" "Ah, that's Ruth, the daughter-in-law of Naomi," he replied. So Boaz was very kind to Ruth and made sure that everyone respected her and let her gather all the grain she needed. In fact, he even let her eat with his servants. When Ruth came home after a hard day's work, she told Naomi all about the kind man named Boaz and how he took special interest in her. Naomi remembered that Boaz was a relative to her dead husband, Elimelech. Now, it was tradition in those days for the closest relative of the family to help in time of need. Naomi saw this as a great opportunity for Boaz to be the family rescuer, or kinsman redeemer, as they called it. She told Ruth that she must continue gleaning from his field. After all, he had been so kind, why go anywhere else? Day after day, Ruth gathered in his fields. Boaz offered her protection, food, and kindness. Day after day, they grew to enjoy being near one another. Naomi was hoping this would happen. Boaz admired Ruth. Ruth admired Boaz. So Naomi came up with a plan. She told Ruth, "Late at night, I want you to go and wake up Boaz. It's time for you to let him know that you want him to marry you. You want his protection, his security, and his love." And that's exactly what Ruth did. Late one night, she came to Boaz as he slept outdoors on the threshing floor. "I am Ruth, your servant. Please protect me." And Boaz did. But there was just one problem. There was another relative of Elimelech that was closer in relation than Boaz. It was technically his responsibility to care for Naomi and Ruth and provide for her a son. So Boaz, being the gentleman that he was, had a town meeting and invited the man. He presented the opportunity to him, and to Boaz's delight, the man refused. Finally, Ruth and Boaz could get married. Soon, they had a baby boy, bringing great joy to both of them and to Naomi, who got to help raise him. Naomi, the old woman who had experienced so much sorrow, was now filled with new vibrancy and joy. This son would not only become the grandfather of Israel's great King David, but Jesus would be one of his descendants.
Okay. Our first question is, who was Naomi? And what was the tragedy that kind of struck her family? What was the sad thing that happened to Naomi? So think about your answers, and once you're done, you can resume the video again. So, like we probably read from the scriptures, Naomi was an Israelite woman who lived in the land of Moab. So she wasn't living in Israel. She had, married someone and gone, and she had lived in the land of Moab. And we read from the early part of Ruth that she first loses her husband, Elimelech. And then later on, she loses her two sons, grown-up sons. These sons had already married and they had wives. And she's now ending up in a home with just herself and the two daughters-in-law, who are Ruth and Orpah. Both of them are now widows. All three of them are now widows because they've lost the dad and they've also lost the two sons whom the two women were married to. So this was the sad thing that struck this Israelite woman while she was living in the land of Moab. She lost her husband and her two sons. So the next question is, what does Naomi now decide to do after all this struggle or after all this, hardship that's come upon her? What does she decide to do after she's lost her family? Again, think about your answers and you can then resume the video. Right, so Naomi now decides to leave Moab and return to Israel. She's getting to a point where she no longer wants to stay in Moab, and she wants to go back to the land of her ancestors, where she could probably be with extended family or extended relatives. And what she does is she lets go of her two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. And she tells them, children, you can go and marry now, remarry now, because your husbands are dead. I don't want to take you along with me and get you to sacrifice your lives for me. I'm old enough. I'm going to go back to my native place, to my native land, and I'm going to be there. But I want you guys to go ahead, live your lives, marry someone, and raise up a home again. So she gives the two daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah, the freedom to leave her and go and marry, someone else because their husbands had now died. And here's an interesting thing. The two ladies respond differently. Ruth and Orpah, they respond differently. So how do they respond? It's probably evident from the picture, but you can take a pause, think about your answers, and then resume the video again. Right, so like you know from scriptures, and you probably would have heard from the story as well, Orpah, she agrees. She's sad to leave Naomi, but she says, all right, I will go back to my family and maybe find someone to marry. I will leave you. But Ruth, on the other hand, she says that she is not going to leave Naomi. She tells Naomi, your people are my people. Your God is my God. And instead of choosing the option to leave Naomi and go back to her family and find someone to marry, she sticks on with Naomi and says, I'm not going to leave you. I want to be with you. Your people are my people. Your God is my God. Right. Our next question now. So after they come back to Israel, Ruth tells Naomi something. She tells her something. And what is it? What does she tell Naomi after they come back to Israel? Think about your answers and resume the video. Right. So Ruth tells Naomi that she's going to go to the fields and pick grain so that she could feed the two of them. I think it's a picture of Ruth telling her mother-in-law, I don't want you to go to work. You're old and you're advanced in age. I don't want you to tire yourself or struggle and work hard and make it difficult for yourself. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to the fields and pick grain. Now, if your children have read your stories or read your scriptures, you would have known that, when God gave the Israelites their commandments on how they had to live and how they had to conduct their businesses, one of the commands that he had given the Israelites was to not completely, empty all the grain when they harvested it. He would tell the Israelites to leave some on the floor or leave some on the grain itself. Those are for the poor people, those in your land who can't afford to buy food or buy their own grain. Let them come and pick of the grain, pick of whatever is remaining. So don't harvest them completely, but leave them leave a little bit behind so that anyone who needs them, who is poor or who doesn't have enough, can come and pick them up. So that's what Naomi is now going to make use of. She's saying to her mother-in-law, I'm going to go work in the fields and I'm going to pick whatever is left over. If there's any leftover grain in the crops or on the fields or any spilt over somewhere, I'm going to gather them and we're going to make food off of that and we're going to eat. But I'm going to do that. You need to stay home. I don't have to, I don't want you to work. And as such, what happens is she ends up working in the field of a person by the name Boaz. Boaz owns a lot of fields. He has a large property there, and there's workers who work in his field, and Ruth ends up working in that field. So we see from here that Ruth was a hard worker. She did not want to live in sympathy. She could have easily, gone back with her mother-in-law and they could have both said, we lost our husbands and we don't have any means to support ourselves, and they could have dwelt on sympathy or handouts. But instead we see that Ruth was someone who wanted to work hard and she wanted to take care of Naomi herself. And like we again see from scripture, Ruth did not, she wasn't keen on finding someone to marry and leave her mother-in-law. She wanted to stay with her mother-in-law and care for her mother-in-law. And it is in those acts of faithfulness, that willingness to care for this mother-in-law, that willingness to work hard, that the Lord leads her to Boaz's field. The Lord could have led her to any field, but in his sovereign will, he leads her to Boaz's field. And just to give you a thought, Boaz is the son of Rahab. We would have seen the story of Rahab in Jericho in one of the stories a few episodes earlier. And Boaz is actually Rahab's son. Rahab was saved by Joshua and his men when they defeated the city of Jericho because she helped them. And Rahab had a son, and he is Boaz. So Ruth is now working in the field of Boaz. So how did Boaz deal with Ruth? How did he treat her? I'm sure you probably know the answer, so think about what you would say and then resume the video. Right, so Boaz, who was the owner of that land, was also a distant relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So when he sees Ruth working so hard, picking up grains and working through the sun, through the day, he had mercy on her, and he even told his workers that she had to get enough grain and that no one had to disturb her, no one had to harass or ill-treat her, and that she had to be safe and that she had to have enough grain to pick and take back home. And again, I believe Boaz would have been thrilled to see how a young woman like Ruth, who could have been so interested to find someone to marry and be off and find a man to marry, ignoring everything else, someone like her, instead of doing all of that, she's careful and faithful to care for the old mother-in-law. She's working hard, and he sees that there's more inner beauty in Ruth than what's on the outside, than what the beauty is on her face. There's more to her than what he can see. So that's where we see that Boaz is thrilled. He's thrilled, and he wants to help her out. So he tells his men to make sure that she has enough grain and she has enough grain to pick off, and also that no one had to trouble her. Right, so what does Naomi, the mother-in-law, now ask Ruth to do? So things are going fine. They're able to get enough food. Ruth is able to work safely without being disturbed. She's able to pick grains and bring back enough food. And Naomi could have just sat back with it and lived with it, but she doesn't do that. She asks Ruth to do something. What is that? Again, you can pause the videos and think about your answer and resume it again. So Naomi knew that it was the Lord who had led her and Ruth to Boaz. And she also knew that Boaz was a distant relative of her late husband Elimelech. So one evening she asks Naomi asks Ruth to go to Boaz and speak to him and literally ask him to marry her. Naomi knew that Ruth was safe in Boaz's field, and she also knew that Boaz was considerate and kind to keep Ruth safe and make sure that she had enough food. We see that Naomi would have definitely been prompted in her heart by the Lord to ask Ruth to do this. And when Ruth heard this, she didn't despise her mother-in-law, because Boaz was actually much older than Ruth. And she didn't despise her mother-in-law, telling her, "Look, why are you asking me to marry this old man? I should marry someone younger or more handsome or more richer." No, she didn't despise her mother-in-law. She took in what her mother-in-law told, and she went ahead and did as such. And we read again from scriptures, as soon as Ruth asks Boaz to marry her, Boaz doesn't jump on it instantly. He's such a pure man. He could have easily, taken care of Ruth's helplessness and her poverty, but instead of that, he's so pure, and he says he would like to do that, but he wants to make sure he does it the right way. So he first checks with another relative. I think they had a custom where if there was a widow, or someone who had lost the head of the household, there was one relative who could, or a closest relative who could redeem that family or redeem that wife and marry her if he wanted to. So he said he was going to check with that first relative and make sure that he would give up on his right. And if he could, then Boaz would then claim Ruth as his wife. So we see how how pure he is. He didn't jump at that that opportunity he had, and even before that, he could have easily made life difficult for Ruth if he wanted to. But instead, we see how humble he was and how merciful he was to make sure that Ruth was taken care of. And here again, we see his faithfulness to make sure that whoever has the first right to claim Ruth he goes and checks with them, finds out that they are okay, and does that. So I think we know again from Scripture, Boaz goes ahead and checks that up with that relative, and he lets go of the claim, and he agrees to marry Ruth. So Boaz and Ruth are married now. They're husband and wife. How did the Lord bless Boaz and Ruth? So go ahead and think about your answers, and then you can resume the video again. So Boaz and Ruth had a son named Obed. So they had a son, and Naomi was also living with them. And we read from Scripture that Naomi was now once again happy. She who had lost her husband and lost her 2 sons is now happy that the Lord has blessed them. He's blessed them with a son, and they named this son Obed. Now, in all of this, you might think, well, this is such a simple story. 2 women come back from a distant land. One of them is younger. She works. She gets married to a faithful man, and they have a son. There's nothing so bright or powerful or magnificent in all of this. Well, that's what we want to learn from Scripture. We want to learn from Scripture what is great in the eyes of the Lord. In the eyes of the world, riches and all the external powerful miracles are great. But in the eyes of the Lord, He's looking for pure and simple people who are devoted to Him. They may have a lot of flaws, they may have a lot of mistakes, but He's looking for those who are faithful to Him in the littlest areas they can. And the way we understand that is Obed, this child of Ruth, is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of King David. So we see how this chosen line that God is so careful to deal with, God is so delighted to deal with, the line of David. And like we know from Jesus' genealogy, Jesus comes from this very line. So if you trace up Jesus' ancestry, it does have King David, yes, but it's not all filled with perfect and powerful and rich people. It's filled with people like Ruth, who was so faithful in the little areas of caring for her mother-in-law, caring for her needs, being willing to marry an older person. The genealogy of Christ includes people like Rahab, who was a prostitute and who lived a very bad life and then finally changed to help the Israelites, help Joshua and his men. And we see that her son is actually Boaz, who's marrying Ruth here. So in all of this, we see God is looking for those who will turn to Him, those who will turn to Him in little areas in their life, in little areas which may not seem significant in the eyes of the world. And that's the line that Jesus picks out. Those are the people whom Jesus picks out to be His ancestors. And that's something that blesses me, how God is faithful to reward honesty and faithfulness in little areas in our lives. May the Lord help us all to grow in that faithfulness. And just like Ruth was a blessing to her mother-in-law, to her husband, and to her son, the little acts of faithfulness we have to one another in our home, to our families, to those who can easily be despised, if we are faithful to honor them, God is faithful to honor every effort we take in, every sacrifice we make, every act of carrying our cross by dying to our will and living for the will of God, living for the will of Christ. God is faithful to honor that. So we want to ask God that He will make us a blessing just like Ruth was. I'll end with the usual credits. All the images we saw are from freebibleimages.org. The video we saw earlier was from Share Faith Kids. And a lot of the truths and commentaries I've understood from the story are from teachings of Brother Zach. You can find more about him on the cfcindia.com website. Thank you, and God bless you.